Up next, we are delighted to welcome Professor Bernard Leca, who will be delivering a talk. Professor Leca teaches at ESSEC Business School, and his research focuses on the impact of organizations on society and government, particularly in the areas of innovation, sustainability, and corporate social responsibility. We are excited to hear his insights on these very important topics.
So thank you very much for having me. Following the conversation, I thought that was really, really interesting. One reason is I do work a lot with Indian colleagues on those issues at the moment, and I also have an increasing number of Indian students, and so that is really super useful for me. When I had a discussion with Amitai regarding what I should be talking about, she suggested I would bring like a European perspective. And so based on the previous discussions, I want to try to take a slightly different angle, because I think a lot that was emphasized was bottom-up approaches and those issues of scaling. And so I'd like to introduce maybe a top-down approach that I would argue is complementary to the bottom-up one. And when I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking about a recent book that was published a couple of years ago. I think it was called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And because I was listening to Professor Gupta, and I thought maybe one approach to climate change, because the thing is so enormous, might be fiction, actually. And within this book, the starting point is a heat wave in India, a heat wave so brutal that millions of people die. And following this, the Indian government is essentially changing. So this is a fiction, of course, but the government is changing its policy and goes for geoengineering to try to change the way the solar heat is hitting the country, so it really sulfur into the atmosphere. And of course, there are multiple effects. Some are positive, some are negative. But when you face such an issue as a government, you need to take action. And actually, even though it is a fiction, one of the interests of this work is that it is based on scientific fact. What Kim Stanley Robinson is doing is doing fiction based on fact. And when you look at the increase in temperature right now at the global level, it is quite alarming. So according to the Paris Agreement signed in 2015, it should be restrained to 1.5 degrees. And we are already reaching 1.6 degrees. And I think that was mentioned within the discussion. When you look at India at the moment, the heat waves are increasing, and it is quite alarming for a lot of people. So the question is, what can we do, and who can take action? And when you look at the figures right now, essentially you have 6 millimeters, and among them are the European Union for around 8% of the emissions, and India for 7% of the emission. And what is happening right now is that European Union is going down, and India is going up, and one of the reasons is development. So the way development is being built right now is based on carbon, which also means that action has to be taken to help communities adapt, but also how do we engage with companies? And that is my topic of research, policy and companies. So that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about. And so whenever you're looking at the European situation, what has been decided in 2019 at the European level by the European Commission is that the overall goal and economic policy of the Union is to try to reach the net zero target by 2050, which means that we should be absorbing as much carbon as we are emitting. And the first target is to reduce the emission by 55% in 2030, that we call the Fit for 55 plan. And actually, the idea is not just to achieve net zero, but also to secure clean energy, to try to save what can be saved of biodiversity, to reduce pollution, to access a circular economy and sustainable food production. And so to do that, essentially the approach, which I think might complement a bottom-up approach, is a top-down approach based on finance. And finance is being considered as a critical enabler of transformation. Why? Because the assumption is you need capital. A lot has to be done using a lot of money on a very short period so that transition can be made. And so there is a whole architecture. So maybe I'm not going to enter into all the detail, but there is a whole architecture right now involving finance, involving companies, that is called the Green Deal architecture. And one aspect that might be interesting is that there is a reporting system for companies called the CSRD. And the CSRD right now is the most complete reporting system, to the best of my knowledge. On those issues, it covers environmental issues, social issues, government issues, all sorts of issues, and it is official. So it is mandatory for companies within the European Union, including some companies that might be outside the European Union, but will be working with the European Union. Behind that, you do have a principle that is being called the double materiality principle. And essentially, the idea is how are companies being impacted by the climate change? That's what is called the financial materiality. And I think that's connected to the conversation about how people are being connected, how people are being influenced by climate change, but also a second form of materiality that is called impact materiality, and essentially is about the way companies do impact climate change, environmental change. And that the issue here is how do we assess this impact, and how do we work with companies to try to reduce this impact? Because of course we can help companies and communities adapting, but also one key issue is how do we reduce the impact, which is likely to be so dramatic that at some point adaptation might be very difficult. So the reason why companies do that at the moment is not for the good of the community, it is more about the risk. And so this approach, which I hope might be complementary to the previous interventions, is about how do we assess the risk and how do we try to reduce those risks. And essentially what is interesting is that those risks were identified by Mark Carney, who used to be the governor of the Bank of England and is now the Prime Minister of Canada. And Carney is essentially saying you have two kinds of risk. One is the physical risk. So those are simple risks. Those are the risks that you see directly and you experiment. That is climate change that you experiment, like what is happening in some part of India, what just happened in Los Angeles with mega fires in Pacific Palisade. But also there is another kind of risk, which is more complex. And that is what you would call the transition risk. And those transition risks are about the assets of company that have no value within a world where you try to reach the Paris Agreement. So within a world where you try to reduce your impact, there are a lot of assets that have no value anymore because they are emitting too much carbon. And that is an issue because we might expect that innovation will reduce carbon emission, because we might expect that regulation will demand that companies reduce emission, because we might expect that consumers, and so the market will be changing as well. So because of that, that can have a huge impact. So, and you need to stop me at some point if I'm too long, please. But so one example, which I find quite fascinating, is something that happened in Poland a few years ago. There was an NGO based in London called Client Earth that bought around 10 shares of a Polish energy producer. And what is happening in Poland is that you produce energy essentially out of coal. And so this producer had a project for a new coal plant in the north of Poland. And the NGO said, well, you cannot develop that because that doesn't work within the Paris Agreement. Poland has been signing the Paris Agreement. Poland is being part of European Union, which has been signing the Paris Agreement. And so you cannot do that. Of course, that was a huge project. And so the board said, no, we are going to go for it. So the NGO went to court, and the court said, you're right. You need to stop the operation. You need to stop the construction because it goes against the Paris Agreement. And so that would be a stranded asset because it doesn't make any sense from a transition perspective. And so that is the beginning of the story. What is also interesting is that following that, the Poland Supreme Audit Office had been auditing the case and argued that the board was doing poorly because of that. They were not fulfilling their fiduciary duty. And they suggested that the shareholders might be suing the board. And that's what they did. So 87% of all the shareholders decided to sue the board members. And right now we are in a situation where the board members are being sued, the board members and their insurers as well, by the shareholders regarding this responsibility. So there's something that is happening right now, and it has to do with liability risk for companies. The more it goes, and the more companies are responsible for what they do. So what they try to do is they try to adapt all around. And whenever you go to adaptation, one of the issues is how do you make sure about the sort of adaptation that you are going to implement. And I just want to give a case that I think would connect to what was said before. It is about air conditioning. One of the big issues right now is about air conditioning. Why? Because increasing heat means that you need air conditioning. It is necessary for people, including old people, to survive in some areas. But on the other end, we know that air conditioning is also what we call maladaptation, in the sense that it is emitting a lot of CO2. It is creating heat islands within cities, and those are issues. So the one question is, what can you do? And I think part of the conversation was about the traditional knowledge and how you can use traditional knowledge. And what is quite interesting for air conditioning is you have some designers now, they built on very old Iranian technique that essentially are more than century old, and they manage within the Iranian desert to find solution to have air conditioning to some extent, just using water and wind. And so either you can do it, and there are plenty of startups that are developing that right now. So of course it's more advanced technologically, but essentially it is based on knowledge, or you can build on nature as well. So there is a design studio, an Indian design studio. I think I'm going to put the reference in the chat. That is called the Ant Studio. And one of the things they've done recently for a factory in India is they looked at the beehive, and they tried to mimetize the beehive using tubes, very simple solution to beat the heat without the air conditioning. And so it is what you might want to call it low tech, but essentially what is happening is that the question of that does question what is an innovation. It essentially questions what do we mean by innovation. Is innovation just adding more stuff to stuff? Or is it sometimes going back to something that was lost and reintroduce that? And the solutions they found, they call it the 3E. It is both ecological, economical, and aesthetical. So it is good looking, it is useful, and it's cheap. And essentially, it is based on ancestral technique that, according to them, go back even to the Egyptians. And it is a solution to today's issues. So to me, from, I would say, the European perspective, climate change is changing everything. It is changing the way we use resources. We need to think about resources as being precious. Every resource, especially carbon. It is about building resilience for companies. We need to think about climate change. That's something that is happening right now, but is likely to be even more important within the next years. And then we need to help companies to adapt to that and to change. It does question what we mean by innovation, the traditional sense, I would say the Western approach to innovation as adding more stuff to stuff. It is about organizing locally, but also nationally and also internationally to address the danger that is a common danger for all of humanity. And to some extent, it is also about rethinking opportunities. And then I stop. Thank you.